Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for St. Paul's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are beginning debate on behalf of the critic for the status of women, the member for Etobicoke North. And this motion concerns an instruction to the Standing Committee on the status of women, on the motion of the motion and the amendment of of the member for Churchill.
In favor of this motion, as you know, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals have consistently supported ending violence against women by any measures that would help do so, and that we've also, as you know, been consistent in the call for a national action plan to end violence against women, as well as since 2010 called for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous Aboriginal women and girls, which we know would very much inform any action plan and any real success in dealing with this terrible tragedy. We also will support the sub-amendment moved by the member from Churchill, as the motion will be amended by replacing the words education and social programs with the words education programs, social programs, and policies. We believe that, of course, that gender-based violence cuts across boundaries, cultures, religious memberships, and socioeconomic status, and we believe that we must all work together to end it, and we believe that a committee and a study by the Status of Women Committee could do a great deal to further the better understanding of this and to put in place recommendations that would actually act on this, and particularly at this time of year where we are also appalled by what has transpired on the campuses in this nation, and we really want to better understand how indeed that people could even talk about in Canada something as appalling as a rape culture. We are upset that despite the repeated calls that this government has refused to take real action, instead favouring the status quo, and as we saw from the so-called action plan that the minister responsible for the status of women tabled a week ago, that we are only seeing a laundry list of things that the government was already doing with no new money, and indeed no real hope for a change in the outcomes based on this. It's interesting, Mr. Speaker, that when we look to what was tabled by the UN in 2008, a framework for action, a program of the United Nations activities and expected outcomes 2008 to 2015, which we can find, and I will post on my website, endviolence.un.org, that in the actual framework of actions, it in 2008 identified the 5 key outcomes as benchmarks for the campaign to be achieved by all countries by 2015, and it's shocking and appalling that its recommendation of an adoption and implementation of multi-sectoral national plans of action that emphasize prevention and that are adequately resourced clearly has not been done by this government. Neither has the framework insistence on the establishment of a data collection and analysis system on the prevalence of various forms of violence against women and girls, as we learned at the Special Committee on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, that the data itself is not good enough, and we look to places like New Zealand for much better data. Also, the idea of establishment of national and local campaigns and the engagement of a diverse range of civil society actors in preventing violence and in supporting women and girls who have been abused, we again can only be saddened by the fact that the minister responsible for the status of women had tabled a so-called action plan that is not what, by when, and how, and neither was any partners or civil society actors named in that action plan, and nor was it adequately funded, as was required in the UN framework for action that Canada should have understood was serious in 2008 when the UN tabled this, and will report next year. I think that the House needs to recognize that in the fall of 2013, the Status of Women critic for the Liberal Party from Etobicoke North tabled a motion at the Status of Women Committee to study violence against women. And while the motion was discussed in camera, clearly the committee has yet to study that issue. Also, the member from Etobicoke North also tabled 7 motions pertaining to the status of women, with one motion specifically calling for a national action plan to end violence against women, M470. And yet nothing happened. While we believe in favor of, and will vote in favor of this motion, we believe it is only one step in a multi-step, multi-pronged approach to ending violence against women. We are saddened that if this Conservative government was serious about ending violence against women, they would pledge to develop a national action plan that had real action in terms of what, by when, and how, with measurable outcomes and adequate funding. And also, we are still disturbed by this government's violent opposition to listening to the stakeholders, the Aboriginal leaders, as well as all the premiers, to call a national public inquiry on violence against Aboriginal women and girls. We hope that this motion will act as a catalyst to take further substantial action to end violence against women and girls in Canada. As you know, Mr. Speaker, every year in Canada, violence and abuse drive over 100,000 women and children out of their homes and into shelters. According to the study by the Department of Justice, violence against women costs Canadian society $7.4 billion each year. And based on 2009 figures, the report states that the cost to victims directly is $6 billion annually, including $21 million in hospitalizations, visits to doctors and emergency rooms, as well as $180 million in related mental health costs. Furthermore, in Canada, women continue to outnumber men 9-to-1 as victims of assault by a spouse or partner. Girls between the ages of 12 and 15 are at the greatest risk of sexual assault by a family member. Aboriginal women, as we only too sorely know, and as we will attend the vigils this Saturday here on the Hill in Toronto and all across Canada for about the missing and murdered women and girls of Indigenous origin, that Aboriginal women are 3.5 times more likely than non-Aboriginal women to be victims of violence. And in 2010, the Native Women's Association of Canada estimated the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls over the last 30 years at 582. We know that this report acknowledged the limitations to the record keeping, as there was no national missing persons database and police records did not always indicate Aboriginal status. The initiative led by the group Sisters in Spirit, which was defunded by this government in 2010, and that's why and when we called for the first call for a national public inquiry, that found that many victims are targeted simply because they are Aboriginal, and their attackers assume that they will not fight back. As we know, this year, in 2014, the report from the RCMP put that number at almost 1,200. In February 2013, we tabled the motion calling for the special committee, and as you know, that the outcome of that committee was seriously disappointing, as the Conservatives used their majority to put in a series of recommendations that were only the status quo, with words like maintain and continue and no real action, no recommendations for new funding, and just a complete betrayal of the responsibility of this government and this Parliament. I hope, Mr. Speaker, that during the upcoming committee hearings, they will hear what a real action plan on violence against women looks like. And I will put on my website today the excellent work of the Library of Parliament's analysis of the Australian National Action Plan. So hopefully once in this country, we will get a national action plan that goes what, by when, and how, and we can stop this terrible tragedy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.